The bidding room went silent the moment the auctioneer read out where the ship had been found, and that silence told me more than any sales record ever could. My name is Keswick Thural, and I have spent 11 years buying wrecks that other people were too afraid to touch. I am not brave. I am broke. There is a difference. And on that day, standing in a cold hangar on the edge of Varan Combine space, the difference was about to cost me more than credits. Debt has a way of narrowing a person's choices, until only the reckless ones remain. Mine had started small, a failed cargo run early in my career, a shipment of refined ore that never made it to its buyer, because a rival broker undercut my delivery contract at the last possible moment. Small debts became larger ones as I chased bigger opportunities to recover what I had lost, and larger debts became the kind that follow a person from station to station, whispered about by creditors who no longer bothered hiding their impatience. By the time I stood in that auction hangar, I owed enough credits to 3 separate lenders that any one of them could have had my transport ship seized within the month if I failed to make a meaningful payment soon. I did not walk into that auction looking for a bargain. I walked in looking for a way out, and desperation has never been a reliable judge of good decisions. The hangar itself was the kind of place designed to make buyers feel like they were getting away with something. Cold metal walls, poor lighting, the faint smell of recycled air that never quite masked the underlying scent of rust and old fuel. Regional impound auctions like this one existed for exactly one purpose: to clear inventory quickly and quietly, moving unclaimed and unwanted vessels off the authorities' books before storage costs ate away whatever value remained in them. Most of what came through these auctions was genuinely worthless. Husks stripped of anything useful, long before they ever reached the auction floor. Every so often, though, something slipped through with real value still intact, and it was that possibility, however rare, that kept brokers like me coming back month after month, hoping to catch the one listing everyone else had somehow overlooked. The auctioneer, a thin, nervous man named Peter Lindquist, who worked the impound circuit for the regional authority, stood on a raised platform in front of a holographic display. Behind him floated a rotating image of a twin-hulled vessel, dark green metal, sharp angles, the unmistakable design of a Miradorn Scout-class warship. Miradorn ships almost never came up for auction. Their people did not abandon vessels. They repaired them, stripped them for parts, or destroyed them rather than let them fall into strange hands. So when one showed up untouched, with full hull integrity and active power signatures, serious buyers usually fought over it like starving animals. That day, nobody moved. I looked around the room. There were maybe 30 buyers present, most of them regulars I recognized from a dozen other auctions. Grace Bennett, who ran a parts brokerage out of the third ring, was staring at her datapad instead of the display. Daniel Voss, a broker twice my size and 3 times my net worth, had his arms folded and his jaw tight. Even Laura Whitfield, who bought anything with a working engine no matter the condition, was inching toward the exit as if she had somewhere else to be. Lot 41, Peter Lindquist said, his voice a little too fast. Miradorn scout vessel, designation unknown, recovered adrift near the edge of the Halvorn dead zone. That was the detail. That was the sentence that made the air in the room change. The Halvorn dead zone sat close to a stretch of space that every civilized species in this quadrant treated with a mixture of respect and dread. It was not claimed territory, not officially, but everyone knew whose ships patrolled near it, and everyone knew what happened to vessels that wandered too close and did not come back the same. Human space. I had never seen a human ship myself. Almost nobody outside their own borders had, not directly, not up close. What we had were stories. Stories from traders who lost cargo runs and came back changed, quieter, unwilling to talk about what they had seen. Stories from military scouts who reported contact and were reassigned within the week, never speaking of it again. Humans kept to themselves, mostly, and the galaxy had collectively decided that the safest way to deal with a species nobody fully understood was to leave a wide, respectful gap around their border, and never ask too many questions about what happened inside it. No inspection report, Peter continued, reading from his pad like a man trying to get through something unpleasant as quickly as possible. No crew manifest, no cargo declaration. Ship's internal logs are largely inaccessible. Sold as is, where is, no refunds, no guarantees. Someone near the back laughed, short and humorless. You mean nobody could get it open? Peter did not answer that. He just moved on to the starting bid, and the number he named was almost insulting for a fully intact warship. It was the kind of number you would expect for a burned-out shuttle, not a Miradorn scout vessel with active power readings. Nobody raised a hand. I stood there doing the math I always did before a bid, the math that had kept me in business through years of bad decisions and worse luck. A Miradorn hull alone, stripped for parts, would clear my debts 3 times over. The weapon systems, if they were even partially functional, would be worth more than that. Even if the ship was cursed, even if it was haunted by whatever the Combine's rumor mill wanted to imagine, metal was metal, and credits were credits. I raised my hand. The room turned to look at me the way people look at someone standing too close to the edge of a cliff. Bid received, Peter said, and I could hear relief in his voice. Relief that someone else was now responsible for this thing, instead of the regional authority's storage yard. Any advance on the bid? Silence. Going once. I felt my own pulse in my throat. Going twice. Daniel Voss shifted his weight, but did not raise his hand. Grace Bennett did not even look up from her datapad. Laura Whitfield had already reached the door. Sold to bidder number 6. That was me. Bidder number 6. The idiot who had just bought a warship that 30 experienced brokers, people who had built careers on taking risks nobody else would touch, had refused to go near. I told myself it was a good deal. I told myself the silence in that room was superstition, old fear passed down through traders who liked a good story more than they liked facts. I told myself all of this while I signed the transfer paperwork, and I kept telling myself the same things 3 hours later, as my small transport ship approached the coordinates where the Miradorn vessel had been left drifting under a containment beacon, waiting for its new and only owner to come collect it. My crew was smaller than I liked, but it was what I could afford. Grace Bennett had come with me on this one, mostly because she did not trust me to inspect a Miradorn engine core without help, and because she was curious in the same reckless way I was. Daniel Voss had turned down every job I offered him for the past month, but showed up anyway for this one, muttering something about wanting to see the thing up close, before deciding whether I had made a genius move or a fatal mistake. And then there was Nathan Cole, my systems technician, quiet, careful, the kind of person who read every warning label twice before touching anything. You know, Grace said as we came within visual range of the ship, in the 7 years I've known you, this might be the first time I've seen an entire auction room go dead silent over a listing. I noticed, I said. Usually silence means the item's junk, worthless, not worth fighting over. This wasn't that kind of silence. She didn't answer, because she had seen it too. It was the silence of people who knew something and were choosing not to say it out loud. The ship came into view through the forward viewport, and even now, being cautious with description because there is nothing about its shape that should have made my chest tighten, I will say this honestly, it looked wrong before I understood anything else about it. Miradorn scout vessels are built for speed and stealth, twin-hulled, low profile, minimal armor because their entire design philosophy relies on never being caught in the first place. This ship had the same silhouette, the same green-black hull plating, the same sensor arrays along its spine, but it also had things that did not belong on a scout vessel. Reinforced plating welded in irregular patches along the underside, as if someone had tried to armor the ship in a hurry, using whatever material was available rather than proper components. Sections of the hull that should have carried sensor housings had been sealed over entirely, smooth metal where instruments used to sit. And running along nearly the full length of the ship, faint under our floodlights but unmistakable once you noticed it, were long scorch marks that did not match any weapon signature I recognized. Not explosive damage, not impact damage, something else, something that had scarred the hull without breaching it. Life support's active, Nathan said quietly from behind his console, reading atmosphere inside, full cycling, temperature regulated. That's not possible, Daniel said. This thing's been drifting for what, months? Longer? No fuel resupply? No maintenance? And it's still running full environmental systems? According to the beacon logs, it was found 4 months ago, I said. Nobody's touched it since. The regional authority just parked a containment marker on it and left it here. Because nobody wanted to be the one to open it, Grace said. Nobody argued with that. We docked using the transport ship's boarding tube, a slow and careful process because the airlock alignment on the Miradorn vessel was slightly off from standard configuration, as if it had been modified after construction. Nathan ran atmospheric checks twice before declaring it breathable. The air readings came back clean. No toxins, no biological contamination, nothing that should have made 4 people hesitate in front of an open airlock door. We hesitated anyway. "After you," Daniel said to me, which was as close as he ever came to a joke. I stepped through first, because it was my ship now, my debt, my responsibility, and because someone had to prove it was safe before I asked anyone else to follow. The interior lighting activated the moment I crossed the threshold, soft blue-white panels running along the corridor ceiling, and for a moment, that felt almost normal, almost like every other Miradorn wreck I had walked through in my career. Then, I noticed the first blast door. It was sealed, and not by any automated system. Someone had welded it shut, manually, from the inside, using tools that left rough, uneven seams rather than the clean cuts of a proper engineering job. Whoever had done it had been in a hurry, or in a state of mind that did not allow for careful work. "Grace," I said, keeping my voice steady, "does that look standard to you?" She ran a scanner over the seam. "No. This was done after the ship was already in service. Somebody sealed this door from inside, using a portable welder, probably in under 10 minutes given how sloppy it is." "Why would you weld a door shut on your own ship?" Nobody answered. Because none of us had a good reason, and the ones we could imagine were not comforting. We moved deeper into the vessel, and the pattern repeated itself 3 more times. Blast doors sealed shut, not through the ship's normal locking mechanisms, but through crude, desperate physical barriers. Each one led toward the same section of the vessel, deep in what should have been cargo storage, far from the bridge and crew quarters. "Somebody was trying to keep something in," Daniel said finally, saying out loud what all of us had been thinking and refusing to voice, or trying to keep something out. "Or both," Nathan added quietly, and I wished he hadn't. Before reaching the bridge, we passed through what had once been the crew's living quarters, a narrow row of small personal cabins branching off the main corridor, each door left open, none of them locked or barricaded the way the deeper sections of the ship had been. Whatever had happened here, it had happened before the crew felt the need to seal themselves away from anything. This part of the ship still held the ordinary, unremarkable evidence of people who had simply been living their lives, right up until they weren't. I stepped into the first cabin out of habit more than curiosity, the old salvager's instinct to check every space for anything worth recording before moving on. A narrow bunk, neatly made. A small shelf holding a handful of personal items, a carved wooden figure of some kind, worn smooth from years of handling, and a folded piece of fabric that might have once been a keepsake from a family member or a partner left behind on some distant world. Nothing about the room suggested panic or a hurried departure. It looked, if anything, like a room whose occupant had simply stepped out for a moment and never come back. "This one's the same," Daniel said quietly from the cabin across the corridor. "Everything in place. No sign of a struggle. No sign of anyone grabbing belongings before running." "That's what bothers me most," Grace said, moving from cabin to cabin with her scanner raised, though I suspected she was reading the rooms as much with her eyes as with her instruments. "Every account we've heard about crews in distress describes chaos, grabbed belongings, forced entries, signs of people trying to save what mattered to them before abandoning ship. This isn't chaos. This is order. Whatever happened here, it happened calmly enough that nobody felt the need to take anything with them. Or they weren't given the chance to feel anything at all," Nathan said quietly, and none of us had a response to that. We continued deeper into the crew quarters, and near the very end of the corridor, I found a cabin different from the others, larger, clearly belonging to someone of rank, given the additional shelf space, and the small personal terminal built into the wall beside the bunk. This had to be the captain's private quarters, separate from the command chair on the bridge where his jacket still hung untouched. The terminal here was dark, powered down entirely, unlike the systems we had encountered everywhere else on the ship. I ran my hand along its edge and found a small, handwritten label affixed beside the interface, words scratched into a strip of adhesive tape, in the same hurried, uneven script we had seen near the sealed compartment doors. "I already know what I saw," Grace translated slowly, reading the label aloud. "I do not need to see it recorded again." I stood there for a long moment, looking at that small, deliberately silenced terminal, understanding for the first time that the captain of this vessel had made a very specific choice to stop documenting his own experience, not because he lacked the equipment to do so, but because he could not bear to relive whatever he had witnessed, even through the safe distance of a recorded log. "He knew what was coming," I said quietly. "Whatever led to those sealed doors, whatever led to the crew disappearing without a struggle, he understood it well enough in advance that he chose silence over documentation, right here, in his own private quarters, before any of it happened. Or he simply couldn't stand to hear his own voice describing it a second time," Daniel offered. But neither explanation made the room feel any less heavy, and none of us stayed in that cabin longer than we had to before continuing on toward the bridge, carrying with us a growing, unspoken understanding that whatever we were about to learn would not be something any of us could easily set aside once we knew it. We reached the bridge eventually, after nearly 40 minutes of careful movement through corridors that felt too clean, too undisturbed, as if the crew had vanished mid-motion rather than fled or fought. Personal items sat exactly where they had been left. A cup, still holding some long evaporated liquid, sat on a console shelf. A jacket hung on a hook near the captain's chair, untouched by dust or decay, in a way that made no sense given how long the ship had supposedly been abandoned. Grace moved to the main console and began working through the interface, her fingers quick and practiced. Miradorn systems were not identical to Combine standard, but there was enough crossover in the underlying architecture that a skilled technician could navigate them with patience. "I'm in," she said after several minutes, trying to pull ship's logs. The display flickered, then filled with error messages, dozens of them, all variations of the same core problem. "Logs have been purged," she said. "Not damaged, purged. Deliberately and thoroughly. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing and made sure nothing usable would be left behind." "All of it?" I asked. "Almost all of it." She frowned at the screen. "There's one compartment showing a data lock I've never seen before. Some kind of secondary encryption layered on top of the standard Miradorn security. It's not letting me anywhere near it. Can you break it?" "Given enough time, probably. But whoever set this up wasn't trying to keep out a casual scavenger. This is built to keep out someone who knows what they're doing." I stood in the center of that bridge, surrounded by the frozen remains of a crew that had clearly fled or died in a hurry, staring at a locked section of data that someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to protect, and I felt the first real crack form in my confidence about the deal I had made that morning. "There's something else," Nathan said, and his voice had changed, gone flatter, quieter. "Deck 3, cargo hold section. I'm reading a physical compartment down there, sealed the same way as those blast doors, manual weld job, but there's a power signature coming from inside it." "What kind of power signature?" "I don't know. It's not matching anything in my database. It's steady though. Whatever it is, it's been running the entire time this ship has been sitting out here. Months, at least." Grace looked at me. Daniel looked at me. Even Nathan, usually the last person to show anything on his face, was watching me with an expression I did not like. "We just bought a ship," I said slowly, "where the crew sealed themselves away from something, purged every record of what happened, and left one section running on independent power long after they were gone." Nobody corrected me. "I want to see it," I said, and I meant it, even though every instinct I had built over 11 years of salvage work was telling me that some doors exist for a reason, and that reason is rarely a good one. We made our way toward Deck 3, moving slower now, each of us more aware of the sound of our own footsteps than we had been an hour earlier. The corridor leading to the cargo section grew narrower, the lighting dimmer, as if the ship itself were trying to discourage visitors from going any further. When we reached the final sealed door, the one Nathan's scanner insisted was drawing steady, unexplained power from somewhere behind it, I noticed something scratched into the metal beside the weld line, not printed, not engraved by machine, scratched by hand, deep and uneven, in the angular script of the Miradorn written language. Grace translated it for me, in a voice that had lost all of its earlier confidence. It says, "Do not open." Nobody moved for a long moment. Then I reached out, placed my hand against the cold metal of that door, and felt the faint, steady hum of something alive on the other side, waiting, patient, and older than fear itself. Nathan wanted to leave the door alone. He said it plainly, without any embarrassment, standing there in the narrow corridor with his scanner still humming in his hand. Whatever is behind that door has been running on its own power for months. It doesn't need us. We don't need it. I say we seal the compartment, tow the ship home, and sell what we can from the rest of it, without ever touching this section again. It was good advice. It was the kind of advice I should have taken. We already own it, I said instead. Whatever's in there is mine now, legally and otherwise. If it's dangerous, I need to know before I bring this ship anywhere near a populated station. If it's valuable, I'm not leaving profit sealed behind a door because a dead crew got spooked. Grace crossed her arms. You're assuming those are the only two options, dangerous or valuable. Aren't they usually? Not always, she said, and something in her voice made me wish I had listened more carefully to that particular warning. We spent the next hour finding a way through the weld without triggering whatever security measures the Miradorn crew might have left behind. Daniel handled the physical cutting, working with a portable torch and more patience than I had ever seen from him, slicing through the crude seam a centimeter at a time, while Nathan monitored the power signature from the other side for any sign of change. "It's stable," Nathan reported every few minutes, and each time he said it, I felt a little more of my nerve return. Stable meant unchanging. Unchanging meant, hopefully, harmless. The door finally gave way with a groan of metal that echoed down the empty corridor longer than it should have. Daniel stepped back, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the ship's regulated temperature, and looked at me. "Your ship," he said, "your call." I stepped through first again, because by that point, it had become something like a rule between us, an unspoken agreement that whoever had made the decision to buy the wreck would be the one to face whatever consequences came with it. The compartment beyond the door was small, barely large enough for the four of us to stand comfortably, and it was empty, except for a single object positioned at its center. A cylindrical unit, roughly the height of a person, constructed from a pale gray material, unlike anything else on the ship. Where the rest of the vessel was built from Miradorn alloys, dark and utilitarian, this object had a different quality entirely, smoother, cleaner, with soft internal lighting that pulsed at slow, regular intervals like a heartbeat. "That's not Miradorn manufacture," Grace said immediately, moving closer with her scanner raised. "The material composition doesn't match anything in their supply chain. It doesn't match Combine manufacture either. Human," Daniel said quietly. Nobody argued with him, because the moment he said the word out loud, all of us recognized the truth of it. We had all heard descriptions of human technology from traders who claimed to have seen fragments of it, salvage pulled from disputed border zones, equipment recovered from encounters nobody liked to discuss in detail, clean lines, understated design, technology that did more than it appeared to, hidden behind a deceptively simple exterior. "It's a stasis unit," Grace said, running her scanner slowly along its length. "I'm reading a life support signature inside. Faint, but active." "Someone's alive in there?" I asked. "Or something is being kept alive in there," she corrected. "There's a difference, and right now, I can't tell you which one this is." I circled the cylinder slowly, keeping a careful distance, studying it from every angle the small compartment allowed. Up close, the surface was not perfectly smooth as it had first appeared. Faint seams ran along its length, so precisely fitted that they were nearly invisible except where the pulsing internal light caught them at just the right angle, revealing thin lines like veins beneath pale skin. There was no visible control panel, no obvious means of opening it, nothing that suggested it was meant to be accessed casually or without proper authorization. "I don't like how calm it looks," Nathan admitted quietly, and I understood exactly what he meant. There was something deeply unsettling about an object radiating such patient, unhurried stillness in a room that 4 sealed doors and a hand-scratched warning had gone to such extraordinary lengths to keep hidden. A weapon would have felt easier to face. A weapon announced its danger honestly. This felt like something that had already decided how the encounter would unfold, long before we had even arrived to have it. Daniel reached out toward the surface, his hand hovering an inch away from the pale gray material, and I found myself holding my breath without meaning to. "Don't," Grace said sharply, and he pulled his hand back immediately, looking almost embarrassed by the instinct that had drawn it forward in the first place. "I wasn't going to touch it," he said. "I just wanted to see if I could feel any warmth coming off it." "Let's not test that theory with our bare hands until we understand what we're dealing with," Grace said, and nobody argued with her. I looked at the object again, at the slow, steady pulse of its internal lighting, and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the ship's environmental controls. Whatever was inside that cylinder, the Miradorn crew had considered it important enough to weld an entire section of their own ship shut around it, and important enough to scratch a warning into the metal with their own hands, rather than trust a simple lock to keep people away. "There's writing on the base," Nathan said, kneeling to examine the unit more closely. "Not Miradorn script this time. Something else." Grace joined him, tilting her head to read the unfamiliar characters etched into a small metal plate near the base of the cylinder. "I don't recognize this language. It's not anything in the Combine Trade Registry." "Human," Daniel said again, and this time nobody bothered to argue. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the pulsing light, feeling the weight of a decision I had not yet made, pressing down on me. Every instinct built over a decade of salvage work told me to seal the compartment back up, tow the ship somewhere quiet, and let someone with far more resources and far less curiosity than me figure out what to do with it. But underneath that caution was something else, something I am not proud of admitting. Curiosity. The same reckless curiosity that had made me raise my hand in that silent auction room when 30 smarter people had kept theirs down. "I want to know what it is," I said. "Not touch it, not open it. Just understand what we're dealing with." Grace looked at me for a long moment, then sighed in the particular way she did when she disagreed with a decision, but had already decided to help anyway. "There's an interface panel here. Looks like it's meant to connect with an external system for diagnostics. If I run a connection through an isolated terminal, one completely separate from the ship's main systems, I might be able to read status information without activating anything." "Do it," I said. "Isolated terminal only. Nothing connected to our transport ship systems." It took her nearly 20 minutes to rig a portable terminal, capable of interfacing with the unfamiliar technology, working carefully, checking every connection twice before committing to it. Daniel and I stood watch near the door while Nathan monitored the power readings, all of us quiet, all of us listening to the soft, steady pulse of that internal light as if it might change the moment we stopped paying attention. "I'm in," Grace finally said, her voice tight with concentration. "Reading diagnostic data now. This is strange." "What is?" "The internal chronometer. According to this, the unit has been active and self-sustaining for far longer than 4 months. Far longer than the ship has supposedly been drifting out here." "How much longer?" She looked up from the terminal. Her expression had gone carefully blank, in the way people's faces do, when they are trying not to show how unsettled they actually are. "Years. This system has been running continuously for years, independent of the ship's main power grid, independent of any external maintenance. It has its own power source, something self-contained, and whatever it is, it's designed to last." "That doesn't make sense," I said. "The Miradorn ship is only a scout vessel. It wouldn't have been operating for years without returning to a supply base." "I don't think the unit came with the ship originally," Grace said slowly, piecing something together as she spoke. "I think this ship picked it up somewhere, took it aboard, and everything that happened afterward, all those sealed doors, all that welding, all the purged logs, happened because of what they brought on board that day." The compartment felt smaller suddenly, the air thicker, though the environmental readings had not changed at all. I thought about the crew's frozen bridge, the abandoned cup, the untouched jacket hanging by the captain's chair, all of it undisturbed, as if the crew had simply stopped existing mid-motion, rather than fled through proper evacuation procedures. "Where's the crew?" I asked, saying the question that had been sitting unspoken in the back of my mind since we first boarded. If they sealed this thing away and abandoned ship, where did they go? There were no escape pods missing from the external count, no launch signatures in what's left of the logs. Nobody answered, because nobody had an answer. and the silence in that small compartment stretched longer than any of us were comfortable with. "I want to try something else," Grace said eventually, her fingers already moving across the terminal. "There's a secondary data partition on this unit, separate from the diagnostic system. It's encrypted, but the encryption pattern looks similar to something I've seen before. Standard human-civilian security protocols leaked through trade intermediaries years ago. If I'm right, I might be able to get partial access without triggering anything." "How partial?" "Enough to read basic classification information, not enough to activate the unit itself. I'm not touching anything close to a wake command, I promise you that." I hesitated, weighing the risk against the growing need to understand exactly what I had brought aboard my life. "Do it." Slowly. She worked in silence for several minutes, occasionally muttering to herself as she navigated an unfamiliar system, translating fragments of interface language through a combination of trade dictionary databases and educated guesswork. Daniel paced near the door. Nathan kept his eyes fixed on the power readings, watching for any fluctuation that might signal trouble. "Got something," Grace finally said, and her voice had changed again, gone quieter, more careful. "Classification header. It's not a full designation, just a partial label, but it's enough to tell us what category this thing falls into." "What does it say?" She read it aloud slowly, sounding out the unfamiliar terms as best she could. "Autonomous Response Unit. Designation, Warden. Deployment class, failsafe." None of those words meant anything specific to me on their own, but together, in the context of everything we had already seen, they formed a shape in my mind that I did not like at all. "Failsafe for what?" Daniel asked. "I don't know," Grace admitted. "The rest of the classification data is locked behind another layer of encryption I can't get through with what we've got here. This isn't something I can crack with a portable terminal and a trade dictionary. This needs proper equipment, proper time, probably back at a real facility rather than inside a sealed compartment on a derelict ship." I looked at the cylinder again, at its slow, patient pulse of light, steady and unbothered by everything we had just learned about it. A failsafe. Left behind, deliberately, on a ship that had ended up drifting near the edge of human space, until a Miradorn scout vessel found it and brought it aboard, apparently without understanding what they were taking. "We're not opening it," I said, more to reassure myself than anyone else in the room. "We're not activating anything. We seal this compartment, we finish inspecting the rest of the ship, and we figure out our next move once we're somewhere safer than an abandoned wreck at the edge of a dead zone." "Agreed," Nathan said immediately, and for the first time since we had boarded, I heard something like relief in his voice. We resealed the compartment as best we could, using portable clamps rather than another crude weld, and made our way back toward the bridge, planning to continue our inspection of the ship's remaining systems before deciding how to proceed. But as we walked, I found myself glancing back over my shoulder more than once, toward the sealed door we had just left behind, half expecting to see that pulsing light bleeding out through the gaps in the metal. It was Grace who found the second piece of the puzzle, back on the bridge, sifting through the fragments of communication data that had survived the crew's attempt to purge their logs. Not everything had been erased successfully. A handful of corrupted audio files remained, damaged, incomplete, but not entirely destroyed. "I think I can recover part of this," she said, working carefully at the console. "It's degraded, but there might be enough here to understand what happened before they sealed that compartment." I sat down in the chair beside her, feeling a tightness in my chest that had nothing to do with the ship's air quality, and waited as she coaxed the first fragments of sound out of a recording that a dead crew had tried very hard to make sure nobody would ever hear. The first fragment was mostly static, a hiss of corrupted data that made Grace wince and adjust her filters twice before anything intelligible came through. When it did, it was a voice, male, speaking in Miradorn, strained in a way that suggested the speaker was trying very hard to sound calm and failing. Grace translated as she listened, her own voice dropping to match the tension in the recording. "This is Captain. The name's cut off. Damaged. To all stations. We are altering course away from previous heading. Repeat, we are altering course. Do not question the order." "That's it?" Daniel asked. "That's the first fragment," Grace said. "There's more. Give me a moment." The second recording was clearer, though still marked with gaps where the data had degraded beyond recovery. This time it was a different voice, quieter, more measured, someone speaking not to the crew at large but into what sounded like a private log. "Personal log," Grace translated, listening carefully to catch every word before the recording cut out again. "We should not have taken it aboard. I said so at the time. Nobody listened. We were told it was abandoned cargo, drifting, no owner, no claim. We were told it was safe to recover." A long pause in the recording, filled with static, before the voice continued. "It is not cargo. I do not know what it is, but I know what it did to Ren when he tried to open the outer casing without authorization. I know what he became for those few minutes before we managed to get him away from it. I have never seen a person's expression change like that. I do not want to see it again." The recording ended abruptly, cutting to silence. "What does that mean?" I asked. "What he became?" "I don't know," Grace said quietly. "The audio doesn't give us more than that. Whatever it means, it scared this person enough to hide it in a private log rather than report it through official channels." She kept searching through the corrupted files, and a few minutes later found another fragment, shorter than the others, degraded almost to the point of being unrecoverable. When she finally coaxed it into something resembling clear audio, the voice on it was different again, younger, unsteady, in a way that suggested exhaustion rather than fear. "This might be Ren himself," she said carefully, listening to the first few words before translating. "Or someone speaking about him directly. I can't quite tell yet." The recording played, halting and broken by static, but clear enough in places to follow. "They keep asking me what I saw," the voice said. "I keep telling them I did not see anything frightening. That is the part they don't understand. There was no monster. There was no threat. There was only a very calm, very complete explanation of something I already suspected, but had never allowed myself to fully believe. I am not injured! I am not damaged! I am only—" Quieter now. "I do not think I will ever raise my voice again without first asking myself whether it is worth doing." The recording cut off there, degrading into static that Grace could not recover no matter how many times she adjusted her filters. "That doesn't sound like trauma from an attack," Daniel said slowly. "That sounds like someone who had a fundamental part of how they saw the galaxy quietly rearranged." "I think that's exactly what it was," Grace said. "Whatever this unit showed him, it wasn't violence. It was information, delivered so completely and so calmly that it changed something in him permanently, without ever needing to raise a hand against him." "That's worse somehow," Nathan said quietly. "A weapon you can prepare for. You can armor against a blade, brace against an explosion, plan a defense against a threat you understand. How do you defend yourself against simply being shown something true that you can never unknow again?" Nobody had an answer to that, and the question sat heavy in the room as Grace moved on to the next fragment, piecing together a timeline out of broken pieces of a story nobody had wanted to tell. According to what she could recover, the Miradorn vessel had encountered the cylindrical unit drifting alone in open space, roughly a year before the ship was eventually found by the Combine's recovery beacon. It had been picked up under standard salvage protocol, logged as unidentified technology, likely of human origin given its design characteristics, and brought aboard for evaluation before being handed over to Miradorn military intelligence at the nearest supply station. That handover never happened. "Something went wrong almost immediately," Grace explained, working through the fragments in order. "One of the crew, this Ren person mentioned in the personal log, tried to access the unit's outer casing without proper authorization, apparently out of curiosity or overconfidence. Whatever happened during that attempt was enough to change the entire crew's approach to the object. Within days, they'd sealed it away, altered course, and stopped transmitting their position to anyone. They went dark on purpose," Daniel said. "It looks that way. And based on the corruption pattern in these logs, I'd guess they spent their remaining time trying to erase every record of what they'd found, rather than trying to get help or report the incident to anyone who might have known how to deal with it properly." "Why would they do that, instead of asking for help?" Grace was quiet for a moment, staring at the console, as if the answer might appear there if she looked hard enough. Maybe they were afraid of what would happen if word got out that a Miradorn scout crew had taken something like this from human territory without permission. Maybe they thought silence was safer than explanation. Or maybe, she added, more quietly, they simply stopped being in a state where reporting anything mattered to them anymore. That last possibility sat heavy in the room, and none of us wanted to examine it too closely. Nathan had been quiet through most of this, working at a separate console, cross-referencing the ship's remaining external sensor logs against known trade routes and border markers. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that made all of us turn to look at him. I found the ship's last confirmed position before it went dark, he said, cross-referenced against navigational charts. It's close, uncomfortably close, to a marked exclusion boundary. Human territory, I said. Not inside it, just outside, in a stretch of space that's technically neutral, but universally avoided by anyone with sense. The kind of boundary line traders warn each other about at every way station along this route. So the Miradorn ship encountered this thing drifting just outside human space, I said slowly, working through the implications as I spoke them aloud. Brought it aboard thinking it was ownerless salvage, and whatever it actually was, ended up unraveling their entire crew before they even made it back to report the discovery. That's my read on it, Grace said. And there's one more thing. She pulled up a final audio fragment, the last one recoverable from the corrupted logs. Badly degraded, barely audible even after her filtering. This is the last entry before the logs go completely silent. The recording played, faint and broken, the voice on it barely holding together. We have sealed the compartment. We are altering course toward the dead zone, hoping the interference there will mask our position from anyone searching for us. I do not know if this is the right decision. I do not know if there is a right decision left to make. If anyone recovers this ship after us, do not open the compartment. Do not wake what is inside it. It does not need to hurt you. It only needs to show you something true. The recording ended there, cutting to static and then silence, and none of us spoke for a long time afterward. It does not need to hurt you, Daniel repeated slowly. What does that even mean? I don't know, I admitted, and for the first time since stepping aboard this ship, I felt something colder than curiosity settling into my chest. Not fear of violence, not fear of some monster waiting to attack us the moment we let our guard down, but a different, quieter kind of dread, the fear of understanding something you cannot ununderstand once you know it. Grace closed the console interface slowly, her hands steady despite everything we had just heard. I think we need to be very careful about what we do next, she said. This isn't a salvage job anymore. This is something bigger than any of us signed up for, and I don't think staying out here trying to figure it out on our own is a good idea. Agreed, Nathan said immediately. Daniel nodded, though his expression suggested he was thinking through something else entirely, some calculation of risk and profit and consequence that I recognized because I had been running the same calculation myself since the moment we found that pulsing light in the sealed compartment. We take the ship back toward Combine territory, I said finally, thinking out loud as much as directing the crew. We report the find through proper channels, let people with actual authority and actual expertise decide what to do with it. We don't touch that compartment again until someone qualified tells us it's safe to. It sounded reasonable, said out loud in the relative safety of the bridge, surrounded by the frozen remnants of a crew that had tried and failed to escape whatever they had found. It sounded like the responsible choice, the choice a careful person would make. But even as I said it, some part of me was still thinking about that steady, patient pulse of light behind the sealed door, still running after all this time, still waiting for someone new to come along and make the same mistake the Miradorn crew had made a year earlier. We began preparing the ship for tow back toward Combine space that same day, running system checks, securing loose equipment, doing everything by the book to make sure the transfer would go smoothly. It was during this process, running a full diagnostic sweep of the vessel's remaining functional systems, that Nathan found something that changed our plans entirely. The compartment's power signature just shifted, he said, his voice tight with an alarm none of us had heard from him before. It's been stable for months, completely unchanging, right up until about 6 minutes ago. Shifted how? I asked, already moving toward his console. Increasing, he said, slowly, but steadily. Whatever's in there, it's drawing more power than it was an hour ago, and I don't think it's doing that on its own schedule. What do you mean? Nathan looked up at me, and for the first time since I had known him, I saw real fear on his face. I think it noticed us. Nobody moved, for a full 3 seconds after Nathan said it, and in that silence, I could hear my own heartbeat louder than I wanted to admit. Noticed us how? I asked, keeping my voice level through sheer force of will. It's a stasis unit. It doesn't have sensors reaching outside its own compartment, does it? I don't know what it has, Nathan said, not looking away from his readings. I only know what I'm seeing, and what I'm seeing is a power draw that started increasing the moment we finished reading those logs on the bridge. That's not a coincidence I'm comfortable with. Grace was already moving toward the door, scanner in hand. It might just be an automated response tied to a timer, or a proximity threshold we crossed without realizing it. Not necessarily awareness. Just a system doing what it was built to do. Does that make you feel better? Daniel asked her. No, she admitted. But it's a more useful thought than assuming the worst before we have any evidence for it. We made our way back toward the compartment together this time, no one willing to stay behind alone on a ship that suddenly felt far less empty than it had an hour earlier. The corridor leading there seemed longer than it had before, though I knew that was only my own nerves stretching the distance in my mind. When we reached the sealed door, the portable clamps we had used to secure it were still in place, undisturbed, exactly as we had left them. Power readings still climbing, Nathan reported, checking his handheld unit against the readings from earlier. Slowly, not dangerously fast, but it's not stopping either. Options, I said, looking at each of them in turn. Tell me what we can actually do here, because I don't have a good instinct for this, and I don't trust my own judgment anymore. We could disconnect whatever's feeding it power, Grace offered, though she didn't sound confident in the suggestion even as she made it. If it's drawing from an internal reserve rather than an external source, cutting that connection might force it back into a fully dormant state. Or it might trigger something worse, Daniel said. We don't know what happens if you interrupt a system like this mid-cycle. For all we know, that could be exactly the kind of interference that causes a bad reaction, instead of preventing one.
We could leave,
Nathan said quietly. Right now, detach the tow line, get back to our own ship, and put distance between us and this thing, before we find out the hard way what it's building toward. It was, without question, the safest option on the table, and it was also, I realized with a sinking feeling, not something I was willing to do. If we leave now, I said slowly, we leave a ship out here that's either going to keep drifting until someone else finds it and makes the same mistakes we almost made, or it's going to keep building toward whatever this power increase is leading to. Completely unsupervised, completely unexplained. I bought this ship. I'm responsible for what happens to it now. I want to understand what we're dealing with before I decide to run from it. That's not always the brave choice, Grace said, not unkindly. Sometimes it's just the reckless one dressed up to look brave. She wasn't wrong, and I knew it, even as I stood there, torn between the instinct to protect my crew by leaving, and the stubborn, uncomfortable curiosity that had gotten me into this situation in the first place. Give me an hour, I said finally. 1 hour to try to understand what's happening through the diagnostic terminal, without touching anything that could activate the unit directly. If the power draw keeps climbing at a dangerous rate, or if anything changes that suggests real danger, we leave immediately. No argument, no hesitation. I'll make that call myself if I have to. Grace considered this, then nodded slowly. 1 hour. And I'm setting a hard limit on the diagnostic connection. If it tries to push data back through the terminal, instead of just reporting status, I'm cutting the link immediately. Agreed. Daniel had been quiet through most of this exchange, standing near the door with his arms crossed, and now he spoke, his voice carrying a weight I hadn't heard from him before. For the record, I think this is a mistake. Not because I doubt your reasoning, Keswick. Because I've been doing this work long enough to know that curiosity and responsibility can look identical right up until the moment they aren't. I'll stay, I'll help, but I want it said out loud that I think we're choosing the harder path when an easier one was sitting right in front of us. Noted, I said quietly. And for what it's worth, I don't disagree with you. I just don't think I can live with myself if I walk away from this without understanding what we found. That's the exact kind of thinking that gets people killed in this line of work, Daniel said, though there was no real anger in it, only tired resignation. Maybe, I admitted, or Or maybe it's the exact kind of thinking that keeps someone else from making the same mistake later, if we handle this properly, instead of running from it. Nathan looked between the two of us, then back toward the sealed door. For what it's worth, I'd rather face this with all four of us together than imagine what might happen if we left it here for the next unlucky broker to stumble onto, without any warning at all. That settled something in the room, some final, unspoken agreement that we would see this through together, whatever the cost turned out to be, rather than divide ourselves over a decision that none of us could fully claim was the safe one. We worked through that hour with a kind of focused tension I had never experienced on any previous salvage job, each of us aware that the decision to stay was built on a foundation of curiosity rather than necessity, and each of us uncomfortable with that fact in our own way. Grace rebuilt the diagnostic connection carefully, running every check twice, while Nathan monitored the compartment's power levels continuously, calling out updates every few minutes, in a voice that grew steadily more strained. "It's stabilizing," he said, about 40 minutes in, and something in his tone suggested relief, mixed with confusion. The power draws leveled off, not decreasing, but not climbing anymore either. "Steady at what level?" I asked. "Higher than the baseline we recorded when we first found it. Significantly higher, but steady." "What does that mean?" Daniel asked. Nathan hesitated before answering, choosing his words carefully. "If I had to guess, based on power consumption patterns I've seen in other systems, I'd say something inside that unit finished some kind of startup sequence and settled into a new operating state. Not full activation, but not the same low, sustaining hum we found it running on originally either. Partial activation," Grace said quietly, confirming the thought all of us had arrived at separately. Through the diagnostic terminal, working carefully within the limits she had set, Grace managed to pull additional status information from the unit's systems, fragments of data that painted a clearer and more troubling picture than anything we had learned so far. "The classification data I found earlier described this as an autonomous response unit," she said, reading from the terminal slowly. "Deployment class, failsafe. There's more information available now that wasn't accessible before. It looks like the increased power state unlocked additional diagnostic layers, maybe as part of whatever internal process it's going through." "What kind of additional information?" "Operational parameters," she said. "Deployment context. According to this, the unit was designed to be left at fixed points along contested or vulnerable border regions. Its function, based on what I'm reading here, isn't offensive. It's not built to attack anything." "Then what is it built to do?" Daniel asked. Grace looked up from the terminal, and the expression on her face was one I had never seen on her before, something between disbelief and dread. "Observe, record, and when appropriate conditions are met, communicate." "Communicate what?" "I don't know yet," she admitted. "But there's a line in this data that keeps repeating across different sections of the classification file, almost like a warning label built into the unit's core programming itself." "What does it say?" She read it slowly, letting each word land on its own. "This unit does not defend itself through force. This unit defends itself through understanding. Proceed only if prepared to understand fully." The compartment felt colder after she said that, though I knew the environmental controls hadn't changed at all. "That's not a threat," Nathan said slowly, working through the implications out loud. "That's something else, something that sounds almost like a courtesy warning, like whoever built this wanted anyone who found it to know exactly what they were choosing before they chose it." "Choosing what?" I asked. Nobody answered, because none of us had an answer, and the not knowing was somehow worse than any clear danger could have been. We used the remainder of our hour carefully, gathering as much information as we could without crossing whatever threshold might trigger further changes in the unit's behavior. By the time the hour was up, we had learned enough to understand that we were dealing with something built with intention and purpose, not some malfunctioning weapon or dangerous creature, but something designed from the ground up to do exactly what it was doing now, patiently, deliberately, without any apparent urgency. "I want to make contact," I said finally, once our hour had run out and Grace was preparing to disconnect the diagnostic link as promised. "Not activate it fully, just attempt communication through the same terminal, see if it responds to anything short of full engagement." "That's a significant step past where we agreed to stop," Grace said carefully. "I know. I'm not asking any of you to be part of that decision. If you want to return to our own ship and wait this out from a safe distance, I understand completely, and I won't think less of any of you for it. Daniel was the first to speak. You're not doing this alone. Whatever it is, we found it together. We see it through together. Nathan nodded slowly, though I could see the effort it took him to agree. Grace looked at the terminal for a long moment, then back at me. If I see anything that looks like a genuine threat, anything at all, I'm cutting the connection immediately. No debate. Understood? Understood. She turned back to the console, fingers moving carefully across the interface, opening a communication channel to a system that had already shown us it was far more aware and far more patient than any of us had expected when we first stepped aboard this ship looking for nothing more than a profitable salvage haul. The terminal screen flickered once, then settled into a new display, simpler than anything we had seen from the unit systems before. A single line of text appeared, rendered in clean, standard trade language, rather than the encrypted classification data we had been working through for the past hour. Acknowledged. Query received. State your intention. Grace's hands hovered over the interface, and I saw her swallow before she typed a careful response. We are attempting to understand what you are, and why you are here. We do not intend harm. The response came almost instantly. Understood. I am a Warden unit, deployed to observe and report on activity near designated border regions. I have been separated from my original deployment point for an extended period. My function has not changed. Your power state changed recently, Grace typed. Can you explain why? Proximity to sustained observation triggered a secondary protocol. When observers demonstrate persistent intent to understand, rather than exploit, I am authorized to engage more directly. This reduces the likelihood of misunderstanding, which historically has led to poor outcomes for observers. I felt a chill reading that last sentence, the careful, almost gentle phrasing of it, the way it seemed to be choosing its words with more consideration than I had expected from an automated system. What happened to the previous crew who found you? I asked Grace to type, and she did, her fingers slower now, more hesitant. The response took a moment longer this time, as if the unit were considering how best to answer. The previous observers attempted to access my systems through forced entry rather than requesting information properly. This triggered a defensive protocol involving direct demonstration of context. The demonstration was accurate and complete. It was not designed to cause harm. It was designed to be understood. Their reaction to that understanding was their own. What kind of demonstration? Daniel asked, and Grace typed the question exactly as he said it. I do not attack. I show. What I show is factual, drawn from archived records related to my deployment purpose. Some observers find factual information more difficult to process than fabricated threats, because fabricated threats can be dismissed as exaggeration. Facts cannot be dismissed so easily. What facts? I asked, my voice quieter now than I intended. There was a pause before the response came, longer than any of the previous ones, as if the unit understood the weight of what it was about to communicate and wanted to give us a final chance to reconsider the question. Are you certain you wish to know? Grace looked at me, her hand still resting over the keys, waiting for my answer before she typed anything further. Daniel had gone very still beside her. Nathan had stopped monitoring his readings entirely, his full attention now fixed on the exchange unfolding across the terminal screen. I thought about the sealed doors we had found throughout this ship, welded shut in desperate haste. I thought about the personal log entry describing what happened to a crew member named Ren during those first few minutes of unauthorized contact. I thought about the final recording, the voice breaking apart as it warned whoever found this ship next. It does not need to hurt you to hurt you. It only needs to show you something true. Every reasonable part of me understood that the answer to this question should be no, that whatever this Warden unit was prepared to show us had already broken an entire Miradorn crew, had driven them to abandon their careers, their command, their own identities as competent officers, in favor of hiding in the dead zone, rather than facing whatever they had learned. Every reasonable part of me understood that curiosity had already cost that crew everything, and that the responsible choice, the choice a careful person would make, was to disconnect the terminal, seal the compartment, and take this ship straight to the nearest authority capable of handling something far beyond my expertise. But I had never been the kind of person who made the responsible choice when curiosity offered a more compelling alternative, and some part of me, some stubborn, reckless part that had raised my hand in that silent auction room when 30 smarter brokers had kept theirs down, needed to know. "Yes," I said quietly, "I want to know." Grace hesitated for one more second, her eyes searching mine, as if looking for any trace of doubt she could use as an excuse to refuse, then typed my answer into the terminal, exactly as I had given it. The response that followed did not come as words. The terminal display changed, and for a moment I thought the connection had simply failed, because the screen filled with what looked like ordinary data, columns of numbers, timestamps, coordinate markers, nothing dramatic or frightening on its surface. Then Grace made a small sound beside me, somewhere between a breath and a word, and I understood that what we were looking at was not ordinary at all. "These are incident logs," she said quietly, scrolling through the data with visible reluctance. "Border incursions, attempts to test or probe human territory over an extended period, dozens of them, maybe more." "Attempts by who?" I asked. "Different parties," she said, still reading. "Some Combine-aligned, some independent. A few from species I don't even recognize the designations for. What happened to them?" She didn't answer right away, and when she finally did, her voice had lost the analytical steadiness it usually carried. "Each entry has a resolution status. Every single one lists the same outcome. Contained, neutralized, returned." "Returned where?" "To their point of origin," she said. "Every single incursion, regardless of scale, regardless of the resources involved, ended the same way. Whatever these people brought toward the border, whatever they intended, it was met, addressed, and sent back, without exception." Daniel leaned forward, studying the timestamps more carefully. "These dates go back years, decades maybe. This isn't a record of one or two lucky defensive actions. This is a pattern, a perfect pattern," Grace said quietly. "Not one entry deviates from the same result. Not one incursion succeeded in any measurable way, regardless of scale, regardless of surprise, regardless of the technology involved. That's not luck. That's not even skill in the way we usually understand it. That's something closer to certainty." "How many entries are we talking about?" Daniel asked, leaning in toward the screen, as if proximity might somehow make the number easier to accept. Grace scrolled back to the top of the log and counted silently for a moment before answering. "Hundreds, spanning what looks like several decades, based on the timestamp formatting, though I can't be completely certain of the exact conversion between their calendar system and ours. Some entries describe single scout vessels testing the edges of the boundary out of simple curiosity. Others describe coordinated fleets, backed by serious military planning, attempting something far more deliberate. And every single one," I said slowly, "ended the same way." "Every single one," she confirmed. "I kept expecting to find at least one exception, one entry where something went differently, where the outcome wasn't quite so clean, or quite so complete. I couldn't find one, not a single deviation across hundreds of recorded incidents." I stared at the scrolling data, at entry after entry describing attempts made by parties far better resourced and far more capable than myself, all of them ending in the same quiet, understated outcome: contained, neutralized, returned. No dramatic destruction described in the logs, no boastful account of overwhelming force. Just calm, procedural language describing the methodical, complete failure of every single attempt to test or threaten a border that most of the galaxy had simply learned, over time, not to approach at all. "This is what broke the Miradorn crew," Nathan said slowly, understanding dawning in his voice. "Not a threat, not violence, just the sheer, complete certainty of this. The knowledge that whatever they were dealing with wasn't guesswork or bluff. It was proven, over and over, against every kind of challenge imaginable, without a single exception in the record." "There's more," Grace said, her voice quieter now. "This isn't just a record of failed attempts. There's context attached to some of these entries, descriptions of what the incursion forces reported afterward, before they were returned." "What do they say?" She scrolled further, then stopped, reading silently for a moment before speaking. "They describe encountering something they couldn't properly categorize. Not overwhelming firepower, not superior numbers, Something calmer than that, and somehow more unsettling because of it. Several reports use almost identical language, independently, from parties who had no contact with each other before or after their incursions. What language? They describe feeling as though whatever met them already understood exactly what they were going to do before they did it. Not through prediction, through pattern, as if humanity had already accounted for their exact scenario long before they arrived, and simply waited, patiently, for them to follow the path that had already been mapped out for them. "Read me one directly," I said. "Word for word, if you can manage the translation cleanly. I want to hear it the way whoever wrote it actually meant it." Grace hesitated, then found a single entry near the middle of the log, one attributed to a fleet commander whose designation had been redacted, but whose account remained largely intact. She read it slowly, translating carefully as she went. "We approached with full tactical advantage, confident in our preparation. What met us offered no resistance in the traditional sense. Every maneuver we attempted had already been accounted for. Every fallback position we considered had already been quietly closed off before we recognized the need for it. There was no engagement in any sense our doctrine had prepared us to understand. There was only the slow, complete realization that we had never controlled any part of the encounter at all, and had perhaps never been in danger of doing so from the very first moment we crossed the boundary." "That's not a battle report," Daniel said quietly. "That's a confession." "I think that's exactly what it is," Grace said. "Written by someone who commanded real forces, real resources, real confidence, and walked away from the experience with none of it intact." The compartment felt smaller again, the air thicker, though nothing about the environmental readings had changed. "That's not a fighting force," Daniel said slowly. "That's something closer to—" He trailed off, unable to find the word he wanted. "Preparedness," Nathan finished for him. "Total, patient preparedness. The kind that doesn't need to threaten anything, because it already knows it doesn't have to." Grace kept scrolling, and the display shifted again, moving from incident reports into something that looked more like a general summary, a kind of closing statement attached to the end of the archived record. "This is the last section," she said. "It looks like some kind of summary note, maybe standard across every deployment unit, like this one." She read it slowly, and none of us interrupted her. "Humanity does not seek conflict. Humanity does not require conflict to prevail in it. Every recorded attempt to test this border has ended the same way. Not through cruelty, not through excess, but through calm, complete resolution. This unit exists to ensure that any party approaching this territory understands the nature of what they are approaching, before misunderstanding leads to unnecessary loss. This is not a threat. This is a courtesy." Nobody spoke for a long moment after she finished reading. "A courtesy," Daniel repeated eventually, his voice strange, caught somewhere between disbelief and something close to awe. "They built a fail-safe unit, whose entire purpose is to calmly explain, using nothing but their own perfect record, exactly why nobody should bother trying anything against them. And they consider that a courtesy." "Because it is one," Grace said quietly. "Think about it. Every incursion in that record ended without catastrophic loss on either side, as far as I can tell. Contained, neutralized, returned, not destroyed, not erased, returned. If they wanted to make an example of every party who tested them, they could have, every single time. Instead, they built a warning system whose entire function is to prevent people from making a mistake they clearly have the power to punish, far more severely than they choose to." I thought about the Miradorn crew, about Wren's unauthorized attempt to access this unit, about the desperate, hurried welding of doors throughout this ship, about a captain's voice breaking apart as he recorded a final warning to whoever might find this vessel next. They hadn't been shown violence. They hadn't witnessed some monstrous attack or catastrophic display of force. They had simply been shown the truth, calmly, completely, without exaggeration, and the truth alone had been enough to unravel them entirely. "It does not need to hurt you," I said quietly, repeating the words from that final recording, understanding them now in a way I hadn't before. "It only needs to show you something true. And once you understand that record," Nathan said slowly, "once you truly understand what it means, that every single attempt against this border for years, maybe decades, has ended exactly the same way without exception, You understand something else too. You understand that whatever line the warden represents isn't a line at all. It's an inevitability. Something you can test, if you want to, but something you cannot beat, and something that already knows you're going to try before you do. I looked back at the terminal, at the calm, patient text still displayed on the screen, at the quiet, methodical record of a species that apparently did not need to raise its voice, did not need to demonstrate cruelty or excess, because certainty itself had proven more effective than any threat could ever be. I understand now. I typed slowly into the terminal, my hands steadier than I expected them to be, given everything I had just learned, why the crew who found you couldn't continue on as they were before. The response came almost immediately, and something about its calm simplicity struck me harder than anything else the unit had shown us so far. Understanding changes people. This is expected. This is, in its own way, the point. I sat with that sentence for longer than I meant to, staring at the calm words on the screen, feeling something shift inside me that I did not have a name for yet. Understanding changes people. This is expected. This is, in its own way, the point. Ask it why, Daniel said quietly from behind me. Why show anyone at all? If the record speaks for itself, if the outcome is always the same, why not just let the border defend itself and leave observers like this out of it entirely? Grace typed the question, and the response came after a pause long enough that I began to wonder if the unit was choosing its words with unusual care. Because silence invites assumption, and assumption invites tragedy. A border that offers no explanation becomes a mystery, and mysteries attract exactly the kind of curiosity that leads capable people to make fatal miscalculations. I exist to remove the mystery, not to threaten, to inform. An informed party who chooses conflict anyway has made a choice with full knowledge of its consequences. An uninformed party who stumbles into conflict has often simply made a mistake. I was built to reduce the number of mistakes. That's almost kind, Nathan said, and I heard the disbelief in his own voice as he said it, as if the word itself felt wrong sitting next to everything we had just learned. It's not kindness, Grace said slowly, working through the thought as she spoke it. Or maybe it is, but it's a strange, cold kind of kindness, the kind that comes from a species so certain of its own strength that it doesn't need to prove anything through force. It only needs to make sure nobody misunderstands what they're dealing with before they commit to something they can't take back. I thought about the auction room again, the silence that had fallen the moment the auctioneer mentioned where this ship had been found. I had assumed, at the time, that the silence was born from superstition, old fear passed down through traders who liked a good story more than facts. Now I understood it differently. That silence hadn't been superstition at all. It had been the collective, accumulated understanding of an entire region of space that had learned, slowly and painfully, exactly what this border represented, and had simply chosen, wisely, not to test it. Ask it something else, I said to Grace, and she looked at me, waiting. Ask it what happens now, to us, to this ship, now that we know what we know. She typed the question carefully, and the response, when it came, was almost gentle in its directness. Nothing happens to you because you ask to understand, rather than attempting to exploit. You have made no aggressive action against this vessel, this unit, or the territory it represents. My function does not include punishing curiosity or honest inquiry. It includes preventing conflict born from ignorance. You are not ignorant any longer. That is sufficient. So we're just free to go, Daniel said, sounding almost suspicious of the simplicity of it. No consequence. No retrieval team coming to collect this thing from us. No punishment for what the previous crew did in trying to force their way into your systems. The response came a moment later, and something in its phrasing made all of us go quiet. The previous crew's actions were addressed appropriately at the time. What happens to this unit and this vessel moving forward depends on the choices you make from this point onward, not on what came before. I would advise, however, that this vessel is known. Its absence has been noted. Its eventual return, in some form, is expected. I felt a chill run through me at that sentence, the calm certainty of it, the implication buried inside those simple words. Its absence has been noted. Its eventual return, in some form, is expected. They know where this ship is, I said slowly. They've known the entire time. Correct. Then why didn't they come retrieve it themselves? Why leave it drifting out here for a year, long enough for a Miradorn crew to find it, take it aboard, and eventually abandon it completely? Retrieval was not necessary. This unit was never in danger of falling into hands capable of misusing it, because its core systems cannot be forcibly extracted or replicated without triggering complete self-destruction of all sensitive components. What remained accessible, the diagnostic layer you interacted with, was designed to be found. Deployment failsafes are sometimes permitted to drift for extended periods, specifically to observe how different parties respond to discovering them. This provides valuable information about behavior patterns near contested regions. We were being studied, Grace said, her voice flat with the particular kind of disbelief that comes from realizing you have been part of an experiment without ever knowing it. This whole time, not just the Miradorn crew, us too. Observed, not studied in the way you may be imagining. There is a difference between observation for understanding and observation for exploitation. I am not attempting to exploit anything about your behavior. I am simply recording it, as I record everything, in case that information proves useful in preventing future misunderstanding. I sat back from the terminal, feeling the weight of everything we had learned pressing down on me at once. A ship deliberately left to drift, not through negligence, but through calculated patience. A crew undone not by violence but by the sheer, complete certainty of a record they could not argue with or dismiss. A species that built courtesy into its warning systems and treated the truth itself as the most effective defense available to them. "What do you want us to do?" I asked quietly, "with what we know now?" The response took longer this time than any before it, and when it finally appeared on the screen, it felt less like a calculated answer and more like something approaching genuine consideration. "That is your choice to make, not mine. I have provided information. What you do with it, whether you choose to share it, hide it, use it for profit, or simply carry it forward as private understanding, is beyond my function to decide. I would only offer this observation. Every party who has understood what you now understand has, without exception, chosen not to test this border again. Draw from that whatever conclusion feels honest to you." Daniel let out a breath he had clearly been holding for longer than he realized. "It's not threatening us into silence," he said slowly. "It's just telling us, plainly, that understanding tends to produce the same result in everyone who reaches it, and trusting us to reach the same conclusion on our own." "Because it already knows we will," Nathan said quietly. "That's the part that scares me more than anything else it's shown us. It's not guessing. It's not hoping we make the right choice. It already knows, because every single person who has understood this before us has made the same choice, and it has no reason to believe we'll be any different." I looked at the terminal one last time, at the calm, patient text still glowing faintly in the dim light of the compartment, and felt something settle inside me that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with a kind of quiet, humbled respect I had not expected to feel toward a species I had never even met. "Thank you," I typed slowly into the terminal, unsure of what else there was left to say, "for not hurting us, for choosing understanding instead." Before Grace could move on, I stopped her with a hand on her wrist, one final question sitting unanswered in my mind since we had first stepped aboard this ship. "Wait, there's one more thing I need to ask." She looked at me, then back at the terminal, and typed the question I gave her, my voice steady, despite the weight of what I was asking. "What happened to the crew? Not what they saw. What happened to them, physically, afterward? There were no missing escape pods, no launch signatures. Where did they go?" The pause before the response this time was the longest yet, long enough that I began to wonder if the question had somehow exceeded the boundaries of what the unit was willing to answer. "That is not information I am authorized to provide directly. I will say only this. No harm was done to them by my function. What happened to the crew after their encounter with me was the result of their own choices, made freely, with injury, in the aftermath of understanding something they could not easily continue living alongside in their prior roles." "That's not an answer," Daniel said quietly, frustration creeping into his voice for the first time since we had begun this exchange. "That's a evasion, dressed up as an answer. Perhaps, but some truths belong to the people who lived them, not to those who ask about them afterward, out of curiosity alone. I will tell you this much, because I believe it may ease whatever concern is driving the question. They are, as far as my records indicate, still alive, scattered, changed, no longer serving in the roles they held before, but alive. Understanding does not require ending. It only requires change, and change, however difficult, is rarely the same thing as tragedy. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding, and beside me, I saw Nathan's shoulders ease slightly, some private worry finally allowed to loosen its grip. "Thank you," I typed again, and meant it more than I had expected to, for telling us that much at least. "You are welcome. I hope you carry this understanding responsibly. Few are given the choice to decide what to do with it. Fewer still choose wisely. I have some confidence in your judgment, based on the manner of your questions, rather than your intentions alone. That confidence is not without limits, however, so I would encourage you to act quickly on whatever decision you reach." Grace closed the terminal connection carefully, her hands finally steady after everything we had just witnessed, and turned to look at me with an expression I had never seen on her face before, somewhere between exhaustion and clarity. "We need to decide what we're doing with this ship," she said quietly. "And I think, given everything we just heard, we need to decide quickly." We gathered back on my own transport ship that evening, leaving the Miradorn vessel tethered outside, its lights dimmed, except for the faint, patient pulse still visible through the small viewport of the sealed compartment. None of us had eaten since boarding hours earlier, and none of us seemed particularly interested in food now, sitting together in the cramped common area of my ship, trying to decide what to do with a decision none of us had ever expected to face. "Let's be honest about the options in front of us," Daniel said, breaking the long silence that had settled over the room. "We could sell the ship, and whatever's inside it, to the highest bidder. There are collectors, private research groups, even certain Combine military contacts, who would pay more for this than either of you can probably imagine. We could disappear with that kind of money and never think about any of this again." "You don't actually believe that's a real option," Grace said quietly. "I didn't say I believed it was a good option," Daniel replied. "I said it was an option. We should at least name it honestly before we decide against it." "Fine," I said. "Named. And rejected. Whatever that warden showed us, whatever record it holds, the last thing this galaxy needs is a private buyer trying to reverse engineer it, or worse, trying to use it as leverage against the very species it belongs to." "Second option," Nathan said, his voice steadier now than it had been aboard the Miradorn ship. "We report the ship through proper Combine channels, hand it over to the regional authority, let them decide what to do with it, and step away from the responsibility entirely. That has its own risks," Grace pointed out. "The moment word gets out that a fail-safe unit like this exists, and that we've already interacted with it directly, we become targets for anyone curious enough to want that same information for themselves. And the Combine Authority isn't exactly known for handling sensitive discoveries with restraint." I thought about the Miradorn crew's decision to hide rather than report, and understood, for the first time, exactly why they had chosen silence over disclosure. It wasn't cowardice. It was the recognition that some knowledge once shared too widely stopped being protection and started being a liability for everyone who held it. "There's a third option," I said slowly, an idea forming in my mind that felt both obvious and terrifying at once. "We take the ship back. Not to a Combine facility, not to a private buyer, back toward the border where it came from." The room went quiet. "You want to fly a stolen human failsafe unit directly toward the one stretch of space every trader in this quadrant has spent their entire career avoiding," Daniel said slowly. "It's not stolen," I said. "It was salvaged, legally, through a proper Combine auction. But you're right about the rest of it. I want to return it. Not because I think we owe them anything specifically, but because keeping it, selling it, or hiding it all lead to outcomes that end badly for someone, eventually. Returning it is the only option where nobody has to be afraid of what happens next." "Except us," Nathan said quietly, "flying directly toward that border ourselves. The warden told us understanding usually leads to the same choice," I said. "Every party who reached this level of understanding chose not to test the border again. I believe that. I think what it's really telling us is that returning what belongs to them, quietly, honestly, without demanding anything in exchange, is the only response that actually respects what we've learned." Grace studied me for a long moment, then nodded slowly. I think you're right. And I think, more than that, I want to see this through properly. Not because I expect a reward, because I think it's the only decision I could live with afterward. Daniel sighed, the particular sigh of a man who had already known, deep down, what the answer was going to be before the conversation even started. Fine. But we do this carefully. No sudden moves near that border. No transmissions they might misread as aggression. If we're doing this, we do it exactly the way that Warden would probably want it done. We spent the following day preparing the Miradorn vessel for the journey, running final checks, securing the compartment properly this time, with careful, deliberate work, rather than the crude, panicked welding the previous crew had relied on. Nathan rigged a passive transponder broadcasting a simple, repeating signal, in the closest approximation of standard trade language we could manage. A message meant to convey exactly what we intended, before we got close enough for any misunderstanding to matter. Unarmed vessel approaching with recovered property for return. No hostile intent, requesting guidance on proper procedure. It felt strange, composing a message meant for a species none of us had ever directly encountered, choosing each word carefully in the hope that whatever received it would recognize honesty when it heard it. But after everything we had learned over the past 2 days, it felt like the only honest thing left to do. We were not the only ones who had noticed the silence in that auction room, it turned out, and we were not the only ones who had drawn conclusions from it. On the morning we prepared to depart Combine space for the border, Nathan picked up an unregistered vessel matching our course from a discreet distance, hanging back just far enough to avoid triggering standard proximity alerts, but close enough that its presence was unmistakable to anyone paying proper attention. "We've got a tail," he said, keeping his voice low even though there was no one aboard who needed the warning kept quiet. "Small transport, no registered beacon, matching our heading almost exactly. Started following us about 20 minutes after we left the auction depot's outer perimeter." "Could be coincidence," Daniel said, though he didn't sound convinced of it, even as he said it. "Could be," Grace agreed, "but I doubt it. Word travels fast in salvage circles, especially about a listing that made an entire auction room go quiet. Somebody's been asking questions about Lot 41 since the moment the sale closed." I brought the unregistered vessel up on our own scanners and studied its profile carefully. It was a modest transport, similar in size and configuration to my own ship, the kind of vessel favored by independent brokers who preferred to work outside official trade registries entirely. Whoever was flying it clearly wanted to avoid drawing attention from Combine authorities, which told me they were either hiding something illegal or hiding an interest in something they didn't want anyone else to know they were chasing. "Open a channel," I said. "Let's find out who's curious enough to follow an unmarked warship 3 days across Combine space." The response, when it came, was immediate, as if whoever was piloting the other vessel had been waiting for exactly this invitation. "Keswick Thural," a voice said, smooth and unhurried, carrying the particular confidence of someone accustomed to getting what they wanted, through patience rather than force. "You've been a difficult person to track down since that auction. I'm impressed, honestly. Most brokers who win a lot like that one either brag about it immediately or panic and try to offload it within a day. You've done neither."
Who is this?
I asked, though something in the voice's easy familiarity told me I probably should have recognized it already. "Said, Peter Lindquist," the voice said, and I felt a flicker of surprise, remembering the nervous auctioneer who had run the sale 3 days earlier, his voice too fast, his hands unsteady on the datapad. This voice carried none of that nervousness now. "I run the auction floor for the regional authority. But that's not the only work I do, and it's certainly not the most profitable. I represent interested parties who prefer their inquiries handled discreetly."
Interested in what, exactly?
"In whatever you found aboard that Miradorn ship," he said, his tone shifting slightly, losing some of its earlier warmth. "You didn't think an entire auction room going silent over a listing like that would go unnoticed, did you? I had at least 4 separate parties contact me within hours of the sale closing, all of them wanting to know who had won the lot, and all of them willing to pay considerably more than the winning bid to acquire whatever's aboard that ship, sight unseen. It's not for sale, I said. There was a pause on the other end, brief but noticeable. I'd encourage you to reconsider that position before committing to it too firmly. The parties I represent are patient, but they are not infinitely patient, and they are not accustomed to being told no by a broker who was, until 3 days ago, drowning in debt he couldn't cover. How do you know about my debt? I asked, though I already suspected the answer. Because information is my business, same as yours, Peter said simply. I know you owe considerably more than you can currently repay through legitimate salvage work. I know the ship you're currently towing could clear that debt several times over if sold to the right buyer. And I know, based on your current heading, that you appear to be moving toward the border, rather than toward any combine facility capable of properly securing whatever you found. Grace's hand tightened on the edge of the console beside me, and I saw Daniel's jaw set in the particular way it did whenever he sensed a situation shifting toward something dangerous. What exactly are you proposing? I asked carefully. A simple transaction, Peter said. Rendezvous at a set of coordinates I'll transmit once you agree, hand over the ship and whatever's aboard it, and walk away with more credits than you'd see from a decade of ordinary salvage work. No further questions asked, no complications, no risk to you or your crew.
And if I refuse?
The pause this time was longer, and when Peter spoke again, his voice had lost every trace of its earlier friendliness entirely. Then the parties I represent will be considerably less patient about the matter, and I can't promise the outcome will be as simple or as bloodless as the offer I've just made you. I closed my eyes for a moment, weighing the threat against everything we had already learned over the past 3 days, and found, somewhat to my own surprise, that the fear I might have felt hearing those words a week earlier had been replaced by something steadier, something closer to resolve. Let me explain something to you, Peter, I said slowly. 3 days ago, I would have taken your offer without hesitation. I would have sold that ship to the highest bidder and never thought twice about the consequences. But I've learned some things since then that I don't think your interested parties have accounted for. Such as? Such as exactly what's aboard this ship, and exactly why an entire auction room went quiet when they heard where it had been found, I said. I'm not selling it to you, or to anyone else you represent. I'm returning it to where it belongs. And I'd strongly advise whoever's backing this offer to reconsider whatever plans they've made regarding that border, because I promise you, they have no idea what they're actually asking me to help them provoke. There was a long silence on the channel, long enough that I began to wonder if Peter had simply cut the connection in frustration. When he finally spoke again, something in his voice had changed, gone quieter, more careful.
You sound very certain of yourself for someone who was drowning in debt 3 days ago, he said.
I am certain, I said. More certain than I've been about anything in a long time. Tell your interested parties that whatever they think they can extract from that ship isn't worth what it will cost them to try. I'm not saying that as a threat. I'm saying it because I've seen the record myself, and I understand now why every single attempt to test that border has ended exactly the same way, without exception. Another pause, and then, quietly, almost reluctantly,
I'll pass that along. For what it's worth, Keswick, I hope you're right about whatever you think you understand.
Because if you're wrong, the people backing this offer won't simply walk away disappointed. The channel closed, and the unregistered vessel peeled away from our course a few minutes later, falling back, and eventually disappearing from our scanners entirely, though none of us relaxed until it had been gone for the better part of an hour. That's not the last we'll hear of that, Daniel said quietly. Whoever's backing him won't just accept a broker's refusal and move on. Maybe not, I agreed. But I meant what I said. I've seen what happens to people who test that border without understanding what they're testing. I'm not interested in finding out what happens to people who try to exploit it secondhand, through threats and intimidation aimed at the person who found it first. Grace looked at me for a long moment, then nodded slowly, some of the earlier tension in her shoulders easing.
You really have changed since we boarded that ship.
I told you, I said quietly. Understanding does that to people. We continued on toward the border after that, more watchful than before, checking our scanners more frequently. But the unregistered vessel did not return, and no further threats came through our comm channels for the remainder of the journey. Whether Peter's interested parties had genuinely reconsidered their plans, or simply decided to pursue a different, quieter approach, I never learned for certain. But the encounter left its mark on all of us. a reminder that the knowledge we now carried was valuable enough that some people would risk a great deal to take it from us, and that the responsible choice, the choice we had already made together, mattered more with every passing hour that brought us closer to the border. The remainder of the journey unfolded across 3 long, quiet days, most of it spent in a tense, watchful silence that none of us tried very hard to break. On the first day, exhaustion caught up with all of us at once, the accumulated weight of everything we had witnessed aboard the Miradorn ship finally settling in, now that there was nothing left to do but wait and watch our instruments. Daniel slept in shifts, waking at odd intervals to check the tow line connection, muttering under his breath about wanting the whole ordeal behind us. Nathan barely slept at all, keeping a near constant vigil over the compartment's power readings, as though sheer attentiveness alone might prevent anything unexpected from happening during the crossing. We took turns monitoring the Miradorn vessel's systems, making sure the compartment remained stable, making sure our transponder signal continued broadcasting at steady intervals. The Warden, for its part, remained quiet throughout the journey. Its power signature settled once more into a steady, unchanging hum, as if it understood exactly what we intended, and had chosen, patiently, to wait and see whether we would follow through. On the second day, Grace found me alone in the cockpit, staring out at the slow crawl of stars beyond the viewport, and sat down beside me without saying anything for a long while. "You're different since we left that ship," she said eventually. "Quieter." "I've been thinking about the auction room," I said, "about that silence when the auctioneer mentioned where the ship had been found. I thought it was superstition, old fear passed down through people who liked a good story. I understand now that it wasn't superstition at all. It was knowledge, accumulated, hard-earned knowledge, carried by an entire region of space that had learned, over years, exactly what that silence meant. And now you carry that knowledge too," Grace said quietly. "Now I carry it too," I agreed. "And I don't know yet what that's going to mean for the rest of my life. Whether I'll ever look at a ship, a border, a warning sign, the same way again. For what it's worth," she said, "I don't think you're the same person who raised his hand in that auction room 3 days ago. That person was reckless, chasing profit without understanding the cost. I think the person sitting here now understands something that person didn't." "What's that?" "That some things aren't meant to be owned," she said simply. "Only understood, and then, if you're wise enough, returned." I didn't have an answer for that, so I said nothing, and we sat together in comfortable silence as the stars continued their slow crawl past the viewport, carrying us steadily closer to a border that most of the galaxy had learned, through hard experience, never to approach without understanding exactly what waited on the other side of it. On the morning of the 3rd day, Nathan's console chimed with an alert none of us had heard before, a soft, insistent tone that pulled all 4 of us toward the cockpit at once. "We're being hailed," he said, his voice tight with a mixture of fear and something that almost sounded like relief. "Direct communication request. Source is..." I don't recognize the signature format at all. "Answer it," I said, my heart pounding harder than it had during any moment aboard the Miradorn ship. The channel opened, and for the first time in any of our lives, we heard a human voice. Channel. It was calm, measured, carrying none of the aggression or menace that years of rumor and fearful trade gossip had led us to expect. "This is Border Monitoring Station Halvorn 7, receiving your transponder signal. We have your position and your stated intention. Maintain current heading and speed. A recovery escort will meet you shortly." "Understood," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "We intend no hostile action. We are returning recovered property, discovered during a legal salvage transaction." "Acknowledged," the voice replied. "We appreciate the honesty of your approach. Not everyone chooses this path." The escort arrived less than an hour later, a single vessel emerging seemingly from nowhere, its hull a smooth, understated gray that seemed to absorb the surrounding starlight, rather than reflect it. It was smaller than I had expected, sleeker, carrying none of the aggressive, weaponized silhouette that rumor had led me to imagine. It simply appeared, silent and precise, matching our course and speed with an ease that made the maneuver look almost effortless. "This is Commander Alice Farrow, aboard recovery vessel Meridian," came the voice over the channel, calm and professional, carrying no trace of hostility, despite everything we had brought toward their territory. "We'll take custody of the recovered unit from here. You have our thanks for handling this responsibly." "You knew we were coming," I said, unable to keep the question from my voice. "Before we even sent the first transponder signal." There was a brief pause before Commander Farrow answered, and when she did, I could hear something that might have been the faintest trace of a smile in her voice. "We've known where that ship was for a long time. We simply chose to see what would happen next. It's not the first time we've learned something valuable from patience. And if we had chosen differently?" I asked, unable to stop myself from asking the question that had been sitting in the back of my mind since the moment Nathan first told me the Miradorn vessel's absence had been noted. If we had tried to sell it or hide it instead of returning it. Another pause, longer this time. "Then we would have handled that outcome the same way we handle every outcome," she said simply, calmly, completely, without unnecessary loss on either side. "But I'm glad we don't have to discuss that particular scenario today." "Can I ask you something else?" I said, surprising myself with the question before I had fully decided to voice it. "The unregistered vessel that followed us out of Combine space, the one that tried to buy the ship from us before we crossed into neutral territory. Did you know about that as well?" There was a brief pause, and when Commander Farrow answered, her voice carried a note I couldn't quite place, something between amusement and quiet acknowledgement. "We're aware of most activity along the approaches to this border. Yes. It's part of how we've maintained the record you already read for yourself. I'll admit, we were curious to see how you'd handle that particular pressure. Some people fold quickly when a large enough offer is placed in front of them." "You were testing us," Daniel said, not quite a question. "Not testing, exactly," she replied, observing. "There's a difference. Even if the distinction feels thin from where you're standing, we don't create the tests. We simply take note of how people respond when the tests arrive on their own, from their own circumstances. Your response to that broker's offer told us more about your intentions than anything you could have said to us directly." "And if I had taken the offer?" I asked quietly. "Then this conversation would be happening under very different circumstances, and I suspect you already understand what those circumstances would look like, given everything you learned before we ever made contact." Her tone remained even, without threat, but the weight of it settled into my chest all the same. "I'd rather not dwell on hypotheticals that didn't happen, though. You made the choice you made. That's the only version of events that matters now." The recovery vessel maneuvered alongside the Miradorn ship with practiced precision, and within the hour, a small transfer team had boarded, quietly and efficiently securing the compartment and preparing the unit for proper transport. None of them seemed alarmed by what they found. None of them seemed surprised. They moved through the process with the calm, unhurried confidence of people who had done this exact task many times before, for many different parties, over many years. I watched from the boarding tube as they worked, 4 figures in simple gray uniforms, none of them armed in any way that I could see, none of them speaking more than necessary, as they carefully disconnected the clamps we had installed and prepared the pale gray cylinder for transport, with the same practiced ease a technician might show handling any ordinary piece of equipment. There was no ceremony to it, no reverence, nothing that suggested they viewed the warden as anything more than a familiar tool being returned to proper service. That casual familiarity told me something important about the scale of what we had encountered. That this ship, this crew, this entire ordeal that had consumed the better part of a week of my life and unraveled an entire Miradorn crew before us, was, to the people now carefully lifting the unit free of its compartment, simply another routine recovery, among many others they had likely performed before. One of the transfer team members paused briefly near the boarding tube before returning to the recovery vessel, a young woman who could not have been much older than Nathan, and she offered me a small, genuine nod before stepping through the airlock. It was such a small gesture, barely anything at all, and yet it carried more warmth than the entire encounter had led me to expect from a species most of the galaxy had spent generations learning to fear from a careful distance. Within another 20 minutes, the transfer was complete, and the recovery team withdrew back aboard their own vessel, leaving the Miradorn ship quieter, and somehow lighter than it had felt at any point since we first boarded it. Before they disengaged from our ship entirely, Commander Farrow's voice came back over the channel one final time. "We've recorded your assistance in returning this unit. If you ever find yourselves near this border again, under any circumstance, that record will be remembered. I'd encourage you to consider that a kindness and not an obligation. Thank you, I said, and meant it more deeply than I had expected to. One more thing, she added, and something in her tone made all four of us lean closer to the comm panel. The warden's log will note that you ask to understand, rather than simply exploit what you found. That distinction matters more than you probably realize. Most people who encounter something like this never bother to ask why. They only ask how much it's worth. The recovery vessel disengaged smoothly, its sleek gray hull sliding away from us with the same effortless precision it had arrived with, and within minutes, it had vanished entirely, swallowed by distance and the quiet, patient dark of the border it was built to protect. We sat in silence for a long time after that, watching the empty space where the vessel had disappeared, none of us quite ready to speak yet about everything that had just happened. "We just gave away a fortune," Daniel said eventually, though there was no bitterness in his voice, only a kind of quiet reflection. "Willingly, for nothing but a thank you and a vague promise of goodwill." "We gave away a fortune," Grace agreed, "but I don't think any of us would trade what we learned for the money we walked away from." I thought about the auction room again, about the silence that had fallen when the auctioneer first mentioned where this ship had been found, and understood now, completely, exactly what that silence had meant. It wasn't fear born from ignorance. It was respect, hard-earned through generations of careful, patient demonstration, built not on threats or violence but on the simple, undeniable weight of a species that never needed to raise its voice, because its actions had already spoken clearly enough, over and over, for anyone willing to listen. I still think about that ship sometimes, the pale gray cylinder pulsing quietly in its sealed compartment, patient and unhurried, waiting for someone new to come along and choose, honestly, what to do with the truth it carried. I think about the Miradorn crew who found it first, undone not by violence but by simple, complete understanding, and I no longer judge them for the choices they made in the aftermath. I bought an empty auction lot because 30 smarter people refused to raise their hands, and what I found waiting inside changed something in me that I do not think will ever change back. Not fear, not exactly. Something closer to respect, the kind that only comes from understanding exactly what waits quietly behind a border most of the galaxy has learned, through hard and patient experience, never to test without knowing precisely what they are choosing to face. I do not know if I will ever encounter a human ship again in my lifetime, but I know now, with complete certainty, that if I ever do, I will not mistake the silence that surrounds them for fear born of superstition. I will recognize it, instead, for exactly what it always was. Understanding, quietly earned, and wisely respected. 3 months passed before I found any real peace with what had happened out there, and even then, peace is perhaps too strong a word for what settled over me in the weeks that followed our return from the border. I did not go back to salvage work immediately. For the first time in 11 years, I found myself unable to look at a listing for an abandoned vessel without wondering what silence might be hiding behind it, without wondering whether the next quiet auction room I stood in was quiet for reasons far more serious than superstition. Grace noticed the change in me before I fully admitted it to myself, and it was she who eventually convinced me that stepping away from the work entirely, even briefly, might do more good than forcing myself back into old habits before I was ready. Daniel took a different path. He left the Combine circuit altogether within a month of our return, taking a modest cut of what remained of my resources and starting a small independent freight business along a quieter trade route, one that kept him well away from any border, dead zone, or unclaimed listing that carried even the faintest whisper of the kind of silence we had encountered that day. I understood his choice completely, though I missed his steady presence more than I expected to. Nathan stayed close, taking on smaller technical contracts while he decided what to do next, and more than once during those quiet months, I found him staring at nothing in particular, lost in some memory of that pulsing gray light behind a sealed compartment door. He told me once, late one evening over a shared meal, that he sometimes dreamed about the warden's calm, patient text scrolling across a terminal screen, and that in his dreams, it never stopped talking, never reached the end of what it had to say, as if the truth it carried had no natural conclusion at all. Grace was the one who eventually convinced me to return to something resembling a normal life. She found new work first, modest contracts, careful and deliberate, choosing jobs with clear provenance and no troubling silences attached to them. When she finally asked me to join her on a straightforward parts recovery contract 3 months after our return, I said yes, and found, to my own quiet relief, that I could still do this work, still feel the familiar satisfaction of a clean, honest salvage job completed properly. But something had changed permanently in how I approached every job afterward. I began asking more questions before bidding on anything. I began paying closer attention to the reactions of other brokers in a room, watching for silences the way I once might have watched for excitement. I never again mistook quiet caution for simple superstition, because I understood now, with complete and permanent certainty, that some silences carry the weight of hard-earned knowledge, passed quietly from person to person, until an entire region of space simply knows, without needing to be told directly, exactly what to avoid and why. I never heard from Peter Lindquist again after our brief, tense exchange during that journey toward the border, though I later learned through mutual contacts that he had quietly stepped back from his auction work within weeks of our encounter, taking up a much smaller, much quieter position, handling routine equipment sales, far from anything resembling a valuable or unusual listing. Whether that change came from fear, from conscience, or from simple prudence, I never learned for certain, and I decided, eventually, that it did not matter enough to ask.
I did receive one final piece of communication related to the entire affair, arriving quietly, without fanfare, roughly 4 months after our return from the border.
It came through an unmarked channel, brief and unsigned, though I recognized immediately the calm, measured phrasing that could only have come from Commander Alice Farrow or someone speaking on her behalf. The message was short. It confirmed that the recovered unit had been properly secured and returned to appropriate service. It thanked me, once more, for handling the matter with what it described as unusual honesty for an independent broker operating outside official channels. And it closed with a single line that I have thought about more often than almost anything else from that entire experience. Understanding, once earned, tends to stay with a person far longer than fear ever does. We hope you carry yours well. I have carried it as well as I know how. I do not tell this story often, and when I do, I choose my audience carefully, because I understand now, better than most, exactly why an entire auction room can fall silent over nothing more than the mention of where a ship was found. I understand why traders trade rumors instead of facts along quiet way station bars near contested borders, and why those rumors, however exaggerated or garbled in the retelling, usually carry a kernel of something true buried underneath the exaggeration. I bought an empty auction lot because nobody smarter than me was willing to raise their hand, and what I found, waiting inside that ship, taught me something I do not think I could have learned any other way. Not through study, not through warning, not through rumor passed carefully from trader to trader across a dozen way stations, only through direct, patient, complete understanding, offered calmly and without malice by something that never once needed to raise its voice to make its point. I think about that pale gray cylinder sometimes, still pulsing quietly somewhere along a border I will likely never approach again, patient and unhurried, waiting for the next curious soul foolish enough, or honest enough, to ask what it truly represents. I hope, whoever that person turns out to be, that they choose the same path we eventually chose, not out of fear, out of respect, earned honestly, for a truth too complete to argue with, and too calm to ever need repeating twice. Grace and I still work together most days now, taking on careful, well-documented contracts that keep us comfortably employed, without ever tempting either of us back toward the kind of reckless bidding that started this entire story. She jokes sometimes that I've become the most cautious broker in the entire combine trade circuit, asking 3 times as many questions before every bid as I ever did before, and she is not entirely wrong to say so. I have simply learned, in the most direct way possible, exactly what can be waiting behind a silence nobody bothers to explain. I still keep one small memento from that entire experience, tucked away in a drawer aboard my ship, rarely taken out, and even more rarely shown to anyone. It is a copy of the final translated line from that hand-scratched warning we found beside the sealed compartment door, written out in my own handwriting on a worn scrap of paper, the words that started this entire journey toward understanding something far larger than myself. "Do not open!" I kept it, not as a warning to myself, since the moment for that particular caution has long since passed, but as a quiet reminder of exactly how close an entire crew came to protecting a truth they never fully understood themselves, and how fortunate I feel, even now, that curiosity led me toward understanding, instead of toward the same fate that unraveled them. Some nights, when the stars outside my viewport look particularly still, and the cargo hold behind me sits especially quiet, I find myself wondering whether that warden unit is still resting somewhere along its border post, patient as ever, watching for the next vessel foolish enough to wander close, ready to offer the same calm, complete courtesy it once offered us. I hope, if that day ever comes for someone else, that they choose honesty over exploitation, the way we eventually did, not because the alternative would necessarily end in violence, but because I have learned, more thoroughly than I ever expected to, that some truths are heavy enough to change a person permanently the moment they are understood, and the only real choice left afterward is deciding how carefully and how honestly that new understanding gets carried forward into everything that follows. That, in the end, is the only lesson I ever really needed from an auction lot nobody else wanted. Not profit, not fear, only the quiet, permanent weight of understanding something true, and the responsibility that comes with choosing, afterward, to carry it wisely.